all the branches will be affected. Not only do you lower cholesterol, you lower other compounds. One of those that we know a lot about is this coenzyme Q. So if you take a statin and you decrease cholesterol levels, let's say by 40 or even 50%, which they're capable of doing, you're going to have a 40 or 50% reduction in CoQ10. It's not avoidable, it's the same pathway. So cells that are active 24 hours a day, every day, very active, and that would be heart muscle cells. They don't rest day or night. They use a huge amount of energy, and therefore heart muscle has the highest concentration of CoQ10, by far.
We have the unfortunate effect, therefore, that by giving a statin to try and reduce cholesterol, we may well be blocking one of the most important molecules in the function of heart muscle. So in effect, while statins may be acting, they think, in a good way, we've got very ample evidence that by blocking CoQ10, we are probably raising the risk of heart muscle failure and therefore heart attacks from a different avenue other than arterial blockage.
Most drugs, if they're going to affect you adversely, you can tell it within a day. You swallow the pill and 30 minutes later you throw up or have diarrhea or have a rash, and then you know not to take it again. Statins are insidious because their side effects begin very gradually over a period of months to years.
My experience shows that statin side effects can be very subtle. They can involve other organ systems. They can present themselves months to maybe years after starting the statin, so it's not necessarily within a short time frame. And by that time, usually a patient gets diagnosed as having a whole new disease, and then they're put on a whole new drug.
For the first 11 years of her career, Dr. Catherine Faraday was a medical officer in the US Navy. She now specializes in dermatology and has a private practice in Austin, Texas.
I took Lipitor for 2 years, and I was fairly sick during that whole period of time. After I stopped taking Lipitor, it took me another 2 to 3 years to get to where I started to feel back to normal. Although most of my dramatic symptoms had gone away, I still had memory issues, which I still have to this day, and my energy levels took a long time to come back. I would be saying something to a patient, and then suddenly the next word would not come. In fact, my whole mind would go blank for a couple of seconds. It was like a whiteout. That was frightening. I didn't know what that was, and again I thought, well, maybe it's just stress. I've been working pretty hard, but at the back of my mind, I started to fear that maybe I was starting to get early Alzheimer's. I couldn't say the word, but that was my fear. I went home and I stayed home for 3 weeks. I was totally exhausted and depleted, emotionally and physically. And all I could do was stay in bed. It was an effort to get out of bed. I was afraid to get out of bed. I've never been so fearful in my life. In fact, fear was the only emotion I had. I couldn't feel happiness. I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even remember being happy. That was the worst I'd ever felt in my life.
Didn't notice anything for about 6 months, and then started to get a lot of pain, muscle aches and insomnia, and I started to feel really genuinely unwell, as if I had flu. I started to keep a diary about statins because my memory loss was so bad. I thought I ought to write this down because no one's ever going to believe it. So I'll just read you a little bit about what I wrote in my diary at the time. I get lots of depression, light sensitivity, amnesia, unable to write, chest pains, leg pains, incredible fatigue, and some days I can't get my legs out of bed. Symptoms are getting worse, and I need to find out what's going on, as I think I am dying. It goes on and on and on like this, and it's quite scary actually, because I would never remembered any of this. I'm so glad I wrote it down, and I urge other people to write theirs down as well, write down what happened to them.
My friends sort of thought I was putting it on, and it weren't until we were up in County actually with 4 of us, having a stroll around Alicante, my walking started to get very tiring, tired legs. And I was having to stop and saying to them, look, you beat a lot, I'll catch up with you sooner or later, because I just couldn't keep up with them. But the memory thing, that's perhaps one of the worst facets of it. I was always sharp, very sharp as a razor. Like I said, I've been in business on and off all my life. I'd remember telephone numbers, you don't know how to tell it, but I'd got it, well, that's it, done. I wouldn't have to think about it. I could go away and think I'd forgotten it and stand there and think, oh yeah, that's it. And I'd have it right. Today I couldn't do that, it would be impossible.
I went to see my doctor and I kept telling him I found it very difficult at work. I was forgetting lots and lots of things and not completing tasks. And he just said, oh, well, you're getting old. You know, we all do that. It happens to all of us when we get to this age. I was 51.
And it just got to the point where life was pretty near unbearable. Constant pain gets you, feeling not well gets you. Waking up in the morning, not feeling rested and thinking, oh, whoopee, another day. Waking up and thinking, oh, Christ, another day.
There were times when I wondered if I really wanted to go on living. I mourned my health. I felt that I had lost my health. And I felt sorry that I hadn't done things like travel and all those things you think you're going to do. And I felt so sorry that I hadn't done that before I'd lost my health. Now, as I'm trying to be healthy, I'm trying to get enough sleep, I'm trying to manage my stress levels, I'm trying to exercise regularly. My cholesterol continues to be very high. However, I've had several echocardiograms, stress tests, EKGs. Nothing's ever showed any evidence of heart disease. So far I'm doing okay.
When you stop statins, it takes a long while to get over. Some people get over it fairly quickly, but by and large, to feel any real relief takes, I would say, a minimum of a year, because that's how I'm starting to feel better. There's just so many of us now. We're all sharing the same symptoms.
I helped moderate a group called Taking Lipitor and Hate It, and I found out the damage that it's done to people like me and to millions of people around the planet.
The commonest side effect is one that you can't really quantify, which is myalgia. That's basically aching in the muscles. If you measure enzymes in the blood that look at muscle damage, you don't see any abnormality. They're relatively common. And in trials, interestingly, people that were given a dummy drug, so there's no active component, the rates of aching was exactly the same as in the population that had the statin. So, and that can occur in anything up to about 7% of people. If you look at significant muscle damage and complications thereof, the rates, depending upon which agent you use, are about 5 per 10,000 treated for a year, or with one drug, which now there have been warnings about at a particular dose, it's about 120 to 160 per 10,000 over a year.
The impression given is that they don't cause, or hardly any, side effects. I was involved partly in a study in Holland, where they asked 50,000 people how many people took statins, what were the side effects. They reckoned there was 30 to 35% of people got significant side effects. Other studies have shown 20%, some studies have shown less. But I personally believe it's in around 20% of people suffer significant adverse events.
I honestly don't believe that doctors do recognize statin side effects, even when they're sitting right in front of them. In the middle of my 2-year illness, I saw my internist for our annual check. After briefly noting that I was seeing several specialists for my dry eye problem, my arrhythmia problem, my colitis problem, and my depression, she then got to the heart of the visit, which was that she was delighted that my cholesterol levels were under control. I find it ironic that neither she nor I ever stopped to question why a relatively young, healthy person had suddenly developed 5 new illnesses in 1 year. And the only new thing in my life was Lipitor.
It's not only possible that GPs aren't reporting adverse effects, it's certain that they aren't. All studies done on reporting of adverse events around the world of drugs have shown that the average reporting varies between 1 to 5%. Most people think it's actually considerably less than that. I would think it's likely that about 1 in 200 adverse events are actually reported. Probably less.
Now we come to an even more serious problem, that is that low cholesterol predisposed to cancer. We have identified at least 11 studies where low cholesterol measured 15, 20, 30, 40 years previously was a risk factor for cancer. One of the most striking findings is made in Japan. Japanese researchers, they gave a small dose of simvastatin to about 40,000 patients and followed them for 6, 7, 8 years. And instead of having a control group, they looked at the cancer frequency in relation to their cholesterol. They measured the frequency of cancer in people with high cholesterol, medium cholesterol, and low cholesterol, all degrees of cholesterol. And they found that those with the lowest cholesterol, those who had achieved the lowest cholesterol value, they had 3 times more cancer cases in that group. There were 3 times more who had died from cancer in that group compared with those who still had normal cholesterol.
And we don't have good follow-up studies. In other words, let's say that somebody's been on statin for 5 years and they develop cancer. Who's to know that? Who's to say, well, you know, we better start looking at, there's no follow-up of that nature.
Clinical trials involving statins have shown that statin benefits vary depending on what is medically known as primary and secondary prevention.
We've had this thing in clinical studies called primary and secondary prevention. Primary prevention means people who have not, say, had a heart attack or a stroke or diagnosed heart disease or something like angina. There are secondary prevention means people who have had a stroke or a heart attack or diagnosed angina. Clinical trials have generally in the past been secondary prevention or high-risk patients, really, I suppose you call them, and primary prevention and low risk. So that's really the difference.
Dr. Malcolm Kendrick is a general practitioner who has been researching and challenging the diet-heart hypothesis for decades.
So what I'm really talking about is the development of the atherosclerotic plaque.
He has also worked with the European Society of Cardiology. We asked Dr. Kendrick how much life extension a person could expect to achieve from taking a statin.
You're asking a question of life extension, which is good, because most people say lives saved or prevention. These terms are relatively meaningless. What people want to know is, if I took a statin for 20, 30 years, which is what people are being told, or 40 years, or however long you think you're going to live for, how much longer could I expect to live? Which is what people want to know. But what we do know is in primary prevention, there is no life extension. There is no increase in life expectancy. Ergo, you won't live 1 day longer.
For primary prevention, it turns out that there is no reduction in mortality. There is no reduction in the rate at which people have serious health events. There is a reduction in the rate at which people have heart attacks, but the reduction in heart attacks is compensated for by other serious illnesses. And the net effect is that you haven't improved people's health.
You might change what's written on the death certificate, but you won't change the date. So primary prevention, no increase in life expectancy at all.
Professor Kaushik Ray is a clinical cardiologist and professor of cardiovascular disease prevention.
In what we know from all the trial data that we've got, bearing in mind that some of the studies have followed people up for about 15 years now, but we don't have long-term follow-up data for many of our interventions. But if you look in a primary prevention population over 5 years, the extension in life over that short period of time is very modest.
Professor Ray was the lead author of a study published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2010 that investigated the effectiveness of statins. The conclusion of this study was that statins do not extend life expectancy when used for primary prevention. This is highly significant because primary prevention accounts for around 75% of all the people who take a statin. So what about the use of statins for people who already have a diagnosed heart problem?
In the secondary prevention population, you're going to gain many more years in the short term. We know that it will prolong life by a couple of years, even over about 5 years, 5 to 10 years or so, because their risk of having an event in that time period is much, much higher because they've already demonstrated they have a tendency to have these events.
At the end of the study, say there were 50 more people alive on the statin arm than the placebo arm. Yes, there may have been. However, if you extend those two lines, how long does it take before those 50 people are now dead? And the answer is a very short amount of time. So I've looked at this with statisticians working in the MRC and using a technique called restricted mean survival time, which does virtually the same thing. And what you find is in the secondary prevention studies, the two that are most quoted, the 4S study and HBS heart protection study, that if you took a statin for 5 years, that was the length of the trial themselves. You took a statin for 5 years, you could expect on average to live for 15 days longer. That's it, total.
Yes, I think you can say that statins reduce the risk or the likelihood of recurrent heart attacks in patients with a history of a heart attack or a history of severe coronary disease or surgical intervention for that. But that's a specific indication. There is absolutely no evidence that it has any role in primary prevention given to healthy people or even people at increased risk for heart disease because they have diabetes, that it has any protective effect.
If the benefits of statins have been exaggerated and cholesterol is not the risk factor we have been led to believe, why have so many doctors bought into the diet heart hypothesis? And how did we get into a situation whereby millions of people are being prescribed medications that could be doing more harm than good?
All right, so what's the truth here? Joining me now is Dr. John Abramson. He is on the clinical faculty at Harvard Medical School.
For more than 20 years, Dr. Abramson practiced family medicine. However, through his independent research, he began to notice an alarming trend within medicine. Dr. Abramson noticed that the scientific evidence was becoming increasingly influenced by commercial interests.
Yes, there's been a radical change in the way medical science is conducted. It coincided with President Reagan coming into office in 1980 in the United States. And he came in with a mandate to downsize government. One of the first things that got downsized was our National Institutes of Health, so that publicly funded research decreased considerably. And researchers who expected to fill out a grant for research in the public's interest suddenly weren't getting funded. And the only source of funding became the commercial interests, primarily the drug companies. When science is commercially funded, the odds are about 5 times greater, surprise, that the science will support the funder's product. So you have 5 times better odds of getting the result you want if you pay for the science.
We are told many, many facts throughout many, many years. And we are beginning to see now that a lot of the facts that we are given are actually somewhat manipulated by the pharmaceutical companies or by other vested interests, such as the food industry, to perhaps give us a flavor or an idea of the benefits of a treatment or a drug that aren't necessarily accurate.
Drug companies not only control the details of how the studies were set up, the protocols, and how the studies were conducted, but they own the research. And this is critically important. The research is done, the drug company compiles the data and processes the data. Peer reviewers read it and say whether it makes sense and the conclusions are justified by the data and so forth. But the real data is not available to the editors of the journal or the peer reviewers. They have to trust that that manuscript is a reasonable summary of the study that was conducted. And often that's not true. We're not talking about some minor details that are spun one way or another. We're talking about major infractions of major violations of scientific standards that are commonplace And that's what doctors are not understanding.
It's a very hierarchical world, medicine. International opinion leaders say it, the national opinion leaders agree, and as it goes down, no one's going to stand up and go, well, I don't believe that. Who are you to say that? So unfortunately, we do have a hierarchical system of people who will generally just go along with what they're told.
If we have a quick look back over the history of some common names and common drugs, we can see that doctors frequently prescribe and then have to turn around and go, sorry, I prescribed on the best interest, in your best interests and on the best advice I had, but I was wrong. Thalidomide, a drug used for anti-nausea, even though it was an anti-cancer drug in its development, but given to women in pregnancy, unfortunately causing deformities in their babies. Vioxx, a famous painkiller.
With Vioxx, a conservative estimate is that 40,000 Americans died of Vioxx, from taking Vioxx. That is close to the number of Americans that died in the Vietnam War, 55,000.
Another concern relates to the actual definition of high cholesterol. Just a few years ago, a total cholesterol level above 250 was considered high, but this threshold has now been lowered to 200. These guidelines originated from an expert panel of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute in America and were adopted by several other countries. The lowering of the threshold, effectively changing the definition of high cholesterol, meant that millions more people became eligible for statin medications. This raised controversy because 8 out of the 9 experts on the panel had financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies that make statins. Although the guidelines were decided by a small number of doctors, they are followed by hundreds of thousands of doctors worldwide.
If they don't follow those and a heart attack happens, and heart attacks happen, those guidelines can be presented in court in a malpractice suit.
A doctor isn't necessarily the one who makes the decisions about the success or harm of a drug, but they prescribe it on the advice that they're given with the absolute best interests of the patient at heart.
And ordinary doctors ought to be brought in as stakeholders in these panels to decide what the evidence really shows. And having experts who have financial ties with drug companies is just like having judges that are getting paid by one of the litigants in a court battle to sit on the bench.
We have been told year by year that we should lower cholesterol even more and more and more. And where's the evidence? I haven't seen any evidence for that argument. The great problem is that these recommendations are written by people paid by the drug industry. How can anybody believe in such recommendations?
60-odd years have passed. And while the science was working, trying to prove the hypothesis, a big and very powerful and very wealthy political and commercial machine has grown on this hypothesis, based on this hypothesis. And this political and commercial machine doesn't want the hypothesis to die.
The level of propaganda and misinformation and even fraud in drug company-funded trials on statins is staggering.
This is World News with Charles Gibson.
The widely used drugs called statins, taken to lower cholesterol, could soon become much more popular.
These are the biggest reductions we've seen in heart attacks and strokes, and thus gives us the evidence we need to expand statin treatment to these new patients. People walking around not knowing that they have a risk of heart attack, and it could be reduced with statin treatment.
But yeah, let's talk about the Jupiter study. First of all, it was a very large study, and it was actually ended early after 1.9 years per person because it showed that it was saving so many lives, and it's really rare for a study to get stopped like that, especially because it has good events. I've read all the cholesterol medications, and I've never been this impressed.
Okay, very interesting.
It's really, it's pretty scary. I read it twice, and it's like, really? And it was a well-done study.
And in the Jupiter study, what we discovered was that in the statin arm of the study, after 2 years, the total number of cardiovascular deaths was 12. And this is a study of thousands of people. In the placebo arm of the study, the total number of cardiovascular deaths was 12. There was no difference. The only difference they found was actually there was less people in the statin arm who died of cancer, and that caused them to stop the trial. But in no other study on statins has this ever been shown. In fact, in other studies, the rate of cancer has been shown to be higher. So, you know, we have a study that's basically stopped for completely wrong reasons.
If the Jupiter trial was stopped for the wrong reasons, why were the results so enthusiastically reported in the media? For example, a 54% reduction in heart attacks was widely reported. In fact, this 54% was a relative risk reduction, which is technically correct, but extremely misleading. In the placebo group, 0.76% of people suffered a heart attack. In the statin group, it was 0.35%. 0.76 minus 0.35 is 0.41%. Therefore, in real terms, the risk of heart attack was only reduced by 0.41%. However, 0.41 is 54% of 0.76. So although we were led to believe the statin halved the risk of a heart attack, in real terms, it only reduced the risk by less than 1/2 of 1 percentage point. 54% was quoted in the media because of the press release issued by the pharmaceutical company funding the trial. AstraZeneca used relative percentages, and this was simply copied by the world's media. All of the statin trials have used these relative percentages, which give us a distorted view of the benefits associated with statins.
The lead author of that article, the Jupiter study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, actually is a co-owner of the patent of the C-reactive protein. That's the measure that's used that is, if people accept Jupiter, would become a universal screening measure. So you have these press releases that are written, and many of the newspapers in the United States not only picked up the story, but actually editorialized about what a breakthrough it was. And really the only media in the United States that got it right was that renowned medical expert, Stephen Cole.